Vladimir Putin has recently been re-elected president by a landslide 87.97% of the Russian vote. With the capture of the strategic city of Avdiivka, his special military operation in Ukraine appears to have swung firmly back in his favor. Just as importantly, Western military aid to Kyiv isn't flowing anywhere nearly as freely as it was at the start of the conflict, and the cherry on top, his shadow fleet of tankers is delivering a steady stream of oil and gas to Asia, neutralizing the effect of Western sanctions on the Russian economy. At first glance, the situation appears more positive for Russia on both the domestic and international fronts than it has in years. You could even say that Putin is in a stronger position than he's ever been at any time during his 20-plus year tenure. So then why is the Russian leader now talking about the potential destruction of civilization? Let's start by looking at comments made by French President Emmanuel Macron in February 2024. Following an international conference in Paris, Macron told reporters that while he and the other 21 European leaders in attendance didn't fully agree on deploying military personnel to Ukraine, the prospect was discussed openly and freely. "Nothing should be ruled out," he said. "We will do anything we can to prevent Russia from winning this war." Putin's response could not have been more furious, chilling, or aggressive. In a report from CNN, the Russian leader issued the following warning. Everything that they are coming up with now, with which they threaten the entire world, all this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization. Don't they understand this or what? Put quite simply, if Macron and other Western leaders sent troops to fight against Russia in Ukraine, it will herald a nuclear conflict. A sobering proposition that sent shockwaves around the world, and when you break things down, it's easy to see why. The war has now entered its third calendar year. A combination of crucial Russian territorial gains and the stuttering nature of Western military aid has weakened Ukrainian resistance. If Macron and the West really are determined to stop Russia from winning the war at all costs, what other option do they have other than sending in their own troops? The only serviceable explanation is that NATO and the rest of the world are not taking Putin's threats seriously. After all, this isn't the first time that the Russian leader has used such incendiary language. At the start of the conflict in 2022, he made a similar statement. Top officials in leading NATO countries have allowed themselves to make aggressive comments about our country. Therefore, I hereby order the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff to place the Russian Army Deterrence Force on combat alert. In some quarters, Macron's stance on potential troop deployment was seen as simply misguided. To others, it was downright reckless. But his words can be taken in a different context altogether. Less an outright statement of intent, and more a way of gauging Putin's reaction. If that was the case, then how worried should the rest of the world be? Very is probably the most succinct response. The election results show the rest of the world that Putin isn't going anywhere soon. Professor Michael Clarke, visiting professor of defense studies at King's College London, told UK newspaper The Daily Express he'll get a sixth term as well if he wants, which will take him up to 2036. If rumors are to be believed, Putin has even altered the Russian constitution to enable himself to rule in virtual perpetuity, 2036 and beyond. Does this indicate, therefore, that Putin has bigger plans on the horizon, plans that could involve a nuclear conflict of some kind? Maybe, maybe not. But Russian expansion in the Arctic region and the carving out of a new trade route to the Asian market could all be part of the bigger picture, strategic moves on the geopolitical chessboard that could lead to all-out war with the West. And if that's the case, then it will be the war the likes of which we've never seen before. Now everyone knows that Russia is one of the world's leading nuclear powers. Historically, at the height of the Cold War, when the threat of nuclear conflict was a very real and terrifying possibility, the former Soviet Union possessed a fierce arsenal of warheads. But what about now? Can Putin back up his threats of the cataclysmic destruction of civilization? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Let's take a look at exactly what kind of nuclear weapons Russia has in its war chest. According to a Washington Post report from October 2022, Russia has the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. In terms of the actual numbers involved, however, it's difficult to provide a completely accurate figure. Nuclear weapons are often divided into two main categories: strategic weapons, long-range missiles that can cross oceans and threaten rival superpowers, and tactical weapons, with more limited capacity and that arguably serve a more limited function. However, we do have some official figures to paint a clearer picture of Russia's nuclear capabilities. Under the terms of the New START, the last remaining arms control treaty, the count of strategic weapons is split among those deployed on intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs), submarine-launched ballistic missiles (SLBMs), and those launched from bombers. Russia's arsenal: 1,912 tactical weapons, 1,185 intercontinental ballistic weapons, 800 submarine-launched ballistic weapons, 580 air-launched from bombers' weapons. That said, some of these figures have to be taken with a pinch of salt, as many Russian weapons are known to be close to being retired or taken offline completely. Still, the sheer numbers of weapons show, in the starkest way imaginable, that Putin's destruction of civilization remarks are not only frighteningly valid, but literally only a push of a button away. But how powerful are these weapons? Not to get too technical, but the power of nuclear weapons can be compared by their yield. This is measured as a TNT equivalent. The US Department of Energy estimates that the American bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had yields of 15 and 21 kilotons respectively, equivalent to 15,000 tons and 21,000 tons of TNT. Modern strategic nuclear weapons have enormous power. Standard missiles can have yields of 500 kilotons, 800 kilotons, and even 1 megaton, equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT. Russia holds the record for the most powerful weapon ever exploded. In 1961, the then Soviet Union tested a bomb of at least 50 megatons, nicknamed Tsar Bomba, which roughly translates as the ruler of all bombs. In comparison, modern tactical weapons typically have a capacity of 10 to 100 kilotons. To put that into an appropriately vivid context, that still makes the average tactical weapon potentially more destructive than the bombs used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both Russia and the US have low-yield nuclear weapons that pack a light punch, even dipping below 1 kiloton. But even the least powerful of nuclear bombs, with a yield between 0.3 to 1.1 kilotons, has the same explosive power as the devastating 2020 Beirut port explosion, which literally leveled the entire area. And we have to mention the sheer variety of missiles at Putin's disposal. Russia has about 500 tactical Air Force nuclear weapons, including gravity bombs and air-to-surface cruise missiles. Many of these will be delivered by the kind of aircraft seen during conventional bombing missions in Ukraine over the last 2 years. These planes include the Tu-22 backfire bomber and the Su-34 fullback. Then there's the 9K-720 Iskander missile system to consider, a ground-based ballistic missile, of which there are around 270 in Russia's arsenal. In terms of the ultimate ramifications, we need to look at the all-important yield again, and what it could mean if any of these weapons were unleashed on the West. If the kiloton number is bigger, the blast is naturally going to be bigger as well. However, terrain can also be a deciding factor. If there are hills in the blast area, they can buffer some of the radiating effects. If the target and the blast occur underground, the ground itself can absorb some of the blow, and whether the weapon is detonated on the surface or just above the surface can also make a huge difference. Then there's the radiation, radioactive debris, and long-term poisoning effects to consider. A worrying prospect, a deadly combination of weaponry, if ever there was one, and enough firepower to most certainly bring about the destruction of civilization. Now we know exactly what kind of nuclear punch Russia potentially packs. Who might Putin be specifically targeting first? Ukraine? That's unlikely. Most experts think that Moscow would use a smaller weapon in the hope of achieving a specific battlefield objective. But those predictions come with an ominous caveat. Once a nuclear weapon is launched, controlling what happens next is difficult, if not impossible. And that not only involves the impact of the missile itself, but also how the wider global community reacts. As Hans Christensen, the director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, observed, once you start talking nukes, all bets are off, so it's not clear how far this will go. A much more likely scenario, and some of the more pessimistic commentators see this as both an inevitable step and perhaps Putin's long-term military objective, is that Russia will target NATO forces with its full nuclear capabilities. After all, the invasion of Ukraine was very much a response to NATO expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. If that's the case, then Russia may well launch a nuclear offensive against Poland first. And while many see this as foolhardy, Poland after all has one of the biggest and best equipped modern armies in Europe, the logic is undeniable. Any Russian incursion into Polish territory provides an additional buffer against hostile forces from the West, and the same could be said of Finland, Sweden, and to a lesser extent the Baltic states. But there is one big stumbling block: Article 5 of the NATO Charter. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. If Putin were to launch an attack, nuclear or otherwise, against any NATO member state, all other member states would be duty-bound to launch their own counteroffensive. That includes the US, UK, and France, etc., all of whom possess a powerful nuclear arsenal of their own. But that may be the whole point, one with even darker and more menacing ramifications, namely that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was only the first step of a far more radical and far-reaching military operation, an all-out attack on NATO itself. In a Newsweek article from 21st of March, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, made several worrying predictions regarding a change to Putin's stance toward NATO. Several Russian financial, economic, and military indicators suggest that Russia is preparing for a large-scale conventional conflict with NATO, not imminently, but likely on a shorter timeline than what some Western analysts have initially posited. Some reports go a step further and paint an even bleaker picture. Shortly after Putin's election for a fifth term, he met with the leaders of Russian State Duma factions to discuss their new priorities for the coming years. He reportedly spoke of the importance of developing the Russian economy and expanding the social programs he announced the previous month. Worryingly, when questioned about possible military escalation, he replied, "Everything is possible in the modern world." And when pushed further, specifically regarding the likelihood of a conflict with the West, he stated, "But I've already said, and that's clear to everyone, that it will be one step away from a full-scale Third World War. I think hardly anyone is interested in this." There is another factor, though, that may be making Western leaders even more anxious. Over the course of the two-year war in Ukraine, it's been suggested that Russia hasn't deployed the full force of its military capabilities. Granted, it's a widely accepted fact that Putin seriously underestimated the staunch Ukrainian resistance and, of course, the level of military aid coming from the West. In fact, he is famously quoted as saying that the conflict would be over in a matter of weeks. Moreover, many of the tactical decisions made in the early part of the conflict, most notably Russia's disastrous attempt to gain air ascendancy over Ukraine, were roundly criticized from all quarters. Evidently, parts of the early invasion were botched, whether through complacency or incompetence doesn't really matter in the bigger scheme of things now. But then if the war in Ukraine has dragged on far longer than Putin initially expected, why hasn't he deployed his most destructive and effective military hardware yet? Surely that would be the logical move in the circumstances, but if the information being leaked from Moscow is in any way correct, Putin may have been keeping his military hardware powder dry. Not only for what many see as the next decisive phase of the Ukrainian conflict, but potentially to open up a war on another front. According to another CNN report, this time from March 2024, Russia is now producing 3 times more artillery munitions than the US and Europe combined. The country is running artillery factories 24/7 on rotating 12-hour shifts. About 3.5 million Russians now work in the defense sector, up from around 1.5 million at the start of the conflict. Furthermore, Russia is importing ammunition. Iran sent at least 300,000 artillery shells last year, and North Korea provided at least 6,700 containers of ammunition carrying millions of shells. And that's not to mention a huge new conscription drive to boost troop numbers on the front lines. Russia has put everything they have in the game, said one intelligence source. Their war machine works in full gear. For Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky, NATO and the rest of the world, these are very worrying signs indeed. No doubt buoyed by the victory in Avdiivka, Moscow may now be looking to push home its advantage, rather than enter what many had predicted would be a consolidatory or even stalemate stage of the war during 2024. Before we go any further, there is one crucial aspect of the situation that we haven't covered yet, and that's Putin himself. You need only look back to the merciless way he has dealt with any serious voices of internal dissension that have emerged in Russia over the 2 decades or more of his reign. Most recently, we have the death of political rival Alexei Navalny in a Siberian prison. Before that high-profile death, figures such as Boris Nemtsov, Alexander Litvinenko, and Anna Politkovskaya were killed in brutal and mysterious circumstances. Then there are the former allies and oligarchs who fled the country as Putin's grip on the country tightened, killed, executed, silenced forevermore. To many, he is an incredibly shrewd and astute political maneuverer who always seems to be one step ahead of his Western rivals. To others, he is a highly dangerous megalomaniac, a loose cannon with nuclear capabilities at the tips of his fingers. If therefore the tide of the war turned in Ukraine's favor, if NATO and the West became actively involved in the conflict, and Russia was staring defeat in the face, how would the man in the Kremlin react? Make no mistake, defeat is not an option for Putin. He could never pull out of the war and retreat to Moscow with his tail between his legs and expect to survive politically. And desperate people in desperate situations have often been known to take desperate measures. That's what makes the current situation so volatile. And it's not as if the West hasn't been warned. Rewind to the years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you could look at any number of warnings Putin issued regarding NATO expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. The ultimate outcome of not heeding those warnings, the special military operation of February 2022. What makes NATO, Macron, and any other Western leaders think that Putin's warnings regarding nuclear conflict would be any different? It's a dangerous game. So often in the past, Putin has routinely flouted international law. There are no democratic institutions in Russia. If you speak out against the regime, you're more or less writing your own death warrant. Putin, and by extension all of Russia, has never played by the same rules as the rest of the world. But would he do the unthinkable, instigate a nuclear conflict with the West? Would he be capable of taking the first steps to the destruction of civilization as we know it? That remains to be seen. And it will be interesting to see what moves Putin makes on the wider international stage in the coming weeks and months, especially considering the horrendous incident that took place just outside of Moscow during the scripting of this video. Of the details to emerge so far, the Islamic State group is claiming responsibility for the brutal attack on a concert hall that killed at least 143 civilians and injured hundreds of others. According to a BBC report, Putin condemned the massacre, the deadliest in Russia for nearly 20 years, during a public address as a barbaric terrorist act. Furthermore, he repeated earlier suggestions by Russian security services that the attackers had tried to escape to Ukraine. Whether that's true or not, or whether the Russian leader is merely trying to associate Ukraine with the terrorist atrocity to stoke anger in his people, is yet to be seen. But it's yet another piece of the ever-shifting geopolitical puzzle that we can only monitor for the time being. The bigger picture remains just as uncertain. While only deployed twice before in history, nuclear weapons have always been seen as the ultimate deterrent. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commanding general in Europe, said of Putin's recent threats of nuclear conflict, "Russian nuclear weapons are more effective when they don't use them." We can only hope the retired general's convictions prove to be correct. One thing is clear though, ever since he assumed power, Putin has always been prepared to go one step further than anyone else, to do what no one else is prepared to do. He is constantly probing and prodding, searching for areas of weakness that he can exploit for his own benefit. So then what of his mentions of the destruction of civilization? Bluster, rhetoric, posturing of the most dangerous kind, or all of the above? What cannot be disputed is that a line in the sand has been drawn. Whether NATO or the leaders of the other major Western governments will risk crossing it remains to be seen. But what do you think? Is Putin prepared to enter a full-blown nuclear conflict with the West, even knowing the consequences of such a reckless course of action? Or is this yet another example of Putin's bluster and rhetoric? Tell us in the comments. Now go and check out Russia's top nuke targets, or click this other video instead.